Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have you most scariest part of the video.
Some friends and I explored an abandoned school. I was the only one that walked out alive. The most sobering moment of my life happened as I hid underneath a moldy and waterlogged desk. Underneath that desk, I realized that, in all probability, this was it. I would never be able to go home again. I realized this as I hid from the snarling and heavy breathing thing I could hear just beyond the thin metal backing of the desk. The thing I was sure of would be the death of me. Sam, Nathan, and Ellie climbed into the truck, a snow-white 2016 used Chevy Colorado, my pride and joy since I had driven it off of the lot only 2 years ago. Having already driven 2 hours, they weren't looking forward to another hour and a half staring out of the window into the dull countryside of rural Tennessee. Once the last seatbelt clicked, I slid the gear shifter in reverse and backed out of the empty back lot of a Barnes & Noble bookstore. Within minutes of reaching the highway, Nathan had put in earbuds. He was content with staring out the window and listening to the latest episode of whatever his latest podcast fixation was. A look in the back seat revealed Sam scrolling through Instagram and Ellie fast asleep on his shoulder. A puddle of drool cast a shadow of inevitability on his shoulder. He didn't seem to pay any attention to it. The silence was fine with me. I liked it, and evidently, so did they. I had only known Sam and Nathan for just north of 4 months, and Ellie only 7 more than that. Yet still, I had no hesitation bringing them along for something I usually did on my own or with one other person at most. They all came off as capable enough to run away if we heard sirens outside, and mentally strong enough not to give up any names if they weren't fast enough. I had heard about this place in passing from some guy online. The post read school abandoned in the late 70s/early 80s, filled with all kinds of cool shit. The post contained a myriad of photos of the hallways, dark and dusty, filled with what seemed like moving boxes filled to the brim with books whose pages were no doubt laced with asbestos by now. The rest of the photos were things he had pulled from said boxes. Some interesting things: old magazines, books, and a cassette tape labeled "Sex You Up," promising enough. There had been times that a place like this looked like this. Old, filled with all kinds of relics from decades and generations that are long in the dirt. A single post was all it took, one look at the geotag on the photo and I knew where it was. I had taken to looking in the inspect menu, as most people don't like to give out addresses to these places. They adopted this faux anonymity for fear of graffiti artists covering the once spotless walls with a myriad of penises, profanity, and bad attempts at tagging their street names. All they did was make it take 20 more seconds for those who knew what to look for. The trip was on the longer end of the spectrum. The GPS had our drive time at 3 hours from my front door. After a quick game of road trip ABCs, everyone was off into their little world. As the exit signs became fewer and fewer, and the 6-lane highway slowly turned into a one-way dirt road, I felt a weird sense of calm. All at once my anxieties about this trip faded. I didn't care if we couldn't get in. I didn't care if we would be the only ones there or not. I pulled into a small, 2-pump gas station only 30 minutes from the decrepit ruins that could barely be called a school anymore. Out of instinct, I pulled out my wallet from my back pocket and flicked my debit card into my left hand. I paused for a moment as I realized that I would need to go inside to pay. Staring at the pump and the decades-old buildup of dirt and muck between the price sticker and the scratch-covered plate glass. Walking inside to pay, I was stopped by a handwritten sign taped to the front door, equally as dirty as the pump. The sign read "Cash only. No card." I stepped inside and was immediately thrown into the past. The walls were plastered with beer and cigarette ads ranging from the 60s to the late 90s. The large room reeked of stale cigarette smoke and antifreeze leaking from the no doubt ancient AC unit. Stepping up to the counter, I felt out of place. In opposition to the sweat-stained t-shirts, ragged jeans, and yellow trucker caps, I wore stainless Levi khaki pants, canvas Nikes, and a thin green flannel. The clerk looked me up and down for a moment. "What do you need?" the aging man behind the counter asked. When he spoke, I was able to count the 5 yellowing teeth he still had left. I pulled out my wallet, 2 crumpled singles, a 20, and a receipt for dinner the night before. "Do you take debit?" "No card," he said, pointing to the sign on the door. "What are all here for?" He motioned between me and the others through the window next to him. "Aren't much to do here but work." He glanced back outside, "and all don't strike me as the type." We're photographers, there's this abandoned school nearby we heard about, it seemed like it was worth the drive. Son, I'm going to give you some advice you best listen to. His accent somehow began to get even heavier as he spoke. Some doors are locked shut for a reason, and sometimes that's for the best. He stared at me with such intensity it felt like he was staring at a hole right through me. When it looked like tears were about to well up, I began to look for any out I could. 20 on pump 2. I slid the bill across the counter. He took it without breaking eye contact. You stay away from there, you hear me? I didn't answer. You best pile your friends back into that spacecraft of a pickup you're driving and turn your happy asses around. Yes sir, I said, turning my heel and making my way out the door. Ellie was perched against the truck bed, eyes trained on Sam next to her. After about 2 minutes the pump shut off and I closed the tank and reholstered the nozzle into the pump. In a moment we were off again. Nathan had one earphone out. Nathan's phone was sitting in the empty cup holder between us. The screen was still on Enigmatique, the tragic mystery of flight number 1015, a story about people going missing. That didn't seem like the best thing to be listening to right now, but who was I to judge? As the road kept going in a straight line I began to zone out, picturing all the things we could find inside, the photos we could take. In what felt like 5 seconds the GPS dinged at me, you have arrived at your destination. When I became fully aware again I found myself parked in front of the school. The faded sign read, Alderson Academy. The Word of God guides us. The lot was barren. Pulling in, my tires warbled and crunched over the tall crabgrass and weeds growing between the cracks in the concrete lot that looked like it hadn't been attended to since before I was born. 3 cars sat dormant at one end of the lot. Lined neatly in a row, all of their windows had been either rolled down or smashed. Their insides had been ransacked as if someone wanted to get rid of any resemblance to the interior of a mid-90s Ford Taurus. The dashes were smashed, glove compartments were gone entirely, and the steering wheels looked like they had been on the losing end of a fight with a sledgehammer. Each interior emitted the slightest hint of bleach from no particular source, as if the entire inside had been drenched at one point or another. Putting on our respirators, I found myself itching for a reason not to go inside. A burning sensation began to form at the pit of my stomach. All of a sudden I was the one with cold feet. I had practically begged these 3 to come with me. I couldn't just turn around. I found myself making a mental list of all the things that could go wrong. When I ran out of any plausible ones after the first few seconds, I fastened my respirator and made my way to the front door, Sam, Nathan, and Ellie not far behind. You do this kind of thing a lot? I heard Nathan ask from behind me. When I turned around to answer him I saw that the question was directed toward Sam. I didn't hear his answer, something about his brother and Peru. My mind was more occupied with what the man at the gas station had said to me before I left. Some doors are locked in a reason. Those words echoed back and forth as I wrapped my fingers around the master brand padlock that held the front door shut. Next to the door stood a stone cherub, slightly green with moss. It held a small basket above its head. Around the back, we stumbled on a window that had been left open. Not smashed, open. Behind the window lay a thick sludge of darkness. So thick my flashlight was unable to pierce beyond a few feet past the window frame. Without hesitation, Ellie jumped through and landed on what sounded like a thin layer of gravel on a linoleum floor. Her personally customized worn Air Force Ones shifted back and forth, slowly eroding the floor with each step. This was layered with the ooze and haha from someone who had never set foot in an abandoned building. Next was Sam and Nathan after him. As I watched them go inside I felt the same burning sensation in my chest that I had only ever experienced at the gas station. It felt like someone was staring right at me. I stuck my head inside the window and my eyes quickly adjusted to the blinding darkness. Everyone seemed off in their little world. Each of them was distracted by a different element in the room. Pulling my head back out I was instantly blinded by the searing light. As I rubbed my eyes I scanned the tree leaned, looking for any reason to pile back in the car and leave. Nothing. I saw a little bit of movement not far into the thicket but managed to convince myself that it was just a squirrel. When my feet landed on what I had correctly assumed was a dirt-covered linoleum floor, I found myself making direct eye contact with a dusty painting of a giraffe picking leaves delicately from a treetop. As I scanned the rest of the room, I noticed everyone filing out of the collapsing doorway and into the main hallway that, from what I could guess from the pictures, stretched the entire length of the building. As I shuffled behind them, all were still taken aback by the enormity of the place. As we began to walk deeper into the maze-like design, beams of light darted from corner to corner, illuminating every crack and crevice the building had to offer. It wasn't long before we began digging through boxes. Our form of archaeology. "Sam! Come look at this," Nathan said as he emerged from a doorway. All at once 3 flashlights blinded him. He was holding something but kept it behind the door out of view. When the light hit his eyes, he shot both hands in front of his face, one to take off his glasses and the other to shield his eyes. As he did, whatever he held slammed to the floor with a loud crash. Whatever glass he was holding was now in 1,000 different pieces scattered around his feet. "Damn it!" He bent down and fished out a small photo from what had been a picture frame and shined a light on it. The picture was similar to Sam. With everything from the dirt mustache that one could almost call a real piece of facial hair, to the shoulder-length, jet black hair. Sam laughed and took the photo and held it up next to his face. I lifted my camera and took a picture. Sam folded the photo and shoved it into his back pocket. "Mine now," he laughed. I began to walk around more, snapping photos of almost everything in sight. In what felt like seconds, I realized I had secluded myself away from everyone else. With each click of the shutter button, the flash shot up and illuminated whatever was in front of it before snapping right back down. I took one last photo before turning around to rejoin the group when I saw a glint of white writing above the doorway that I could barely make out in the darkness. "The path to salvation begins with a single step." I figured it looked nice with the light leaking through an open door with light spilling through and onto the filthy linoleum ground. I raised my camera and snapped a photo. When the flash briefly clicked on, it revealed a long red gash to the left side of a door that led into a bathroom that I had only just noticed. I clicked the button on the bottom of my light, and it sprung to life for all of 6 seconds before sputtering out. I tried everything to turn it back on aside from replacing the batteries with new ones I didn't have. In all honesty, I should have left here, no worse off than when I had entered. But I didn't. Instead, I resolved to use my camera as a makeshift flashlight, using every flash to map out where I was. The first flash went off and I was all of 3 inches from smacking my nose into a wall. The second flash went off and I was able to get my bearings and fell my way to the edge of the bathroom hall. When my fingers were wrapped around the cold edge of the painted cement blocks, I took another photo and watched as the gash got wider, with small spatters branching out from the top and bottom. Something akin to a monochrome Pollock painting. As my camera flash went off again, it illuminated something I still have trouble describing. A desecrated corpse. It resembled more of a puddle than a human. Blood, viscera, and chunks of flesh-covered muscle were strewn about on the floor, creating a standing puddle of dried blood. Maggots pulsed in and around where I assumed the face was at one point or another. It didn't feel real. I lost my balance as I stared into the darkness. Having seen the flash, my mind was able to vaguely remember the outline of what was lying not 3 feet away in complete and total darkness. Unnatural darkness. My ears began to ring, and my legs gave out. My eyes dilated into tunnel vision as I landed heavily on my wrists and smacked my head against the wall behind me. I must have been screaming because in no time Sam, Ellie, and Nathan were standing over me. When they first arrived, I could only make out vague muffled sounds as they beamed their flashlights into my eyes. As they stood over me, my hearing dialed back into reality, and I became more aware of the aching coming from the back of my head and the burning sensation in my throat. I had, no doubt, been screaming. "What's wrong?" Ellie shouted at me. Before I had a chance to answer for myself, Nathan did it for me, letting out a yelp that was cut short by a string of vomit. Sam stood numb, shining his flashlight on the remains. Ellie noticed it next. She let out a shrill and ear-piercing scream. You don't react the same way you think you would in a situation like this. I always found myself watching horror movies telling the characters to stop standing there and just run. But at that moment I finally understood what true fear was. It was paralyzing. It held all of us in place like statues. As we all stood there, sobering up from what we had just witnessed, an even worse thought crossed my mind. What did this to him? And even worse, is it still here? All of these thoughts took hold of everything inside of me, and the only way I could convey them to the group was 4 words. We need to leave. I stood to my feet, using Ellie's wrist and arm as a support to gain my footing. Jesus Christ, Nathan said as he wiped his mouth. What happened to him? His question came off as an equally genuine and morbid curiosity. The way his voice cracked, it sounded like it almost hurt him to squeak out the question. Sam was still frozen. His light was still shining on the corpse. He watched the maggots and insects pulse and scatter around every square inch of exposed nerve. Judging by the oxidization of the blood, whoever this once was had been here for at least a few days. No more than 2 weeks at most. Shit! Ellie let out. We all glanced over to see her holding her phone above her head. The white background of the emergency dial screen illuminated the brickwork. No signal. No, you've got to be doing something wrong, Sam said, finally snapping out of whatever trance he had been in before beginning to make his way toward her. You can dial 911 no matter what company's tower you're connecting off of. Well, then there's no fucking tower, Sam. Her voice began to break too. None of us knew how to deal with this sort of thing. Who do you call? Where do you tell them you are when there is nothing else for miles? When Sam finally tried the phone for himself, he was met with the same busy/no service signal Ellie had heard. In an instant, they stopped arguing. From down the hall, the unmistakable sound of boots on the dirty linoleum floor inched toward us at a slow, steady pace. We didn't know what to do. We froze in place for what felt like centuries as the footsteps inched closer with every step. Whoever had been walking must have heard us notice them, because they let out a shrill and almost inhuman shriek that echoed through the hallways. It was met with what sounded like a half-dozen more from outside the building. Just down the hallway behind us was the cracked open door of what I can assume used to be a classroom of some kind. Nathan was the first to spot it. Opting to leave us and slink his way over without so much as a tap on the shoulder. I grabbed Sam and Ellie, and soon we were right behind him. The classroom was laid out as stereotypically as one could imagine a classroom from the mid-70s. One large wooden and water-damaged desk at the front of the room was assigned specifically for the teacher, followed by 4 columns of 7 all-in-one desks. Along the left side of the room were 3 double-door coat closets. Sam and Ellie took one of those while Nathan and I sought refuge behind the desk at the front of the room. As Ellie and Sam shut the door behind them as they crawled inside the closet, they let the door drop with a loud clatter against the body of the wardrobe. I could hear them mentally cussing at the same time I was. The footsteps got closer. None of us could see, but judging from where they had stopped, I was guessing the person was standing in the doorway. I held my breath, as did Nathan next to me. I held it so long all I could hear was my heartbeat growing faster and faster until I was sure it was about to explode. My hands were glued to the floor. Every muscle in my body was stiff. I did my best to minimize anything that could make any noise whatsoever. A lump formed in my throat as I continued to hold my breath past the point of safety. I wasn't able to exhale until I heard Ellie's loud piercing scream come from the closet. I peeked my head over the desk, the large hulking figure that had made its way into the room. Its body was almost humanoid, a deer standing on its hind legs. Its arms were impossibly long and sloped off its emaciated body. The tips of what I can only describe as claw-bearing fingers were dripping with blood. Following the trail up and across its face led me to the fresh corpse of Sam. His face had been smashed against the coat hook on the inside of the closet. The end stuck through his eye socket, while the rest of his damaged eye clung to a small strand of an optical nerve that hung just below his chin. Faster than my eyes or brain could comprehend, the thing had its first closed around Ellie's throat before slowly squeezing closed. The blood rushed to her face, turning it beet red. Her eyes went bloodshot while refusing to blink at the monstrosity before her. Almost trying to deny what was happening. Rationalize. This only lasted for roughly a second before the thing made a complete fist with a loud crack in Ellie's neck. Her hoarse screams ceased, and her head dropped like a floppy children's toy. The thing relished at the moment, letting out 3 short and shrill screams at the top of its lungs, dripping blood and saliva down the tattered and bloody clothes it wore. By their condition, I assumed it had been stolen from another person who had probably come to explore. When it grabbed and ripped off Sam's hanging eye and raised it to its lips, I slowly and carefully lowered myself back down to the ground below the desk. Nathan had plugged his ears with his hands and sat in the fetal position. I didn't blame him. Given my history of dealing with traumatic events, I'm still surprised I wasn't doing the same thing. The sounds it made were awful. A cacophony of slurping, snapping, and ripping sounds drifted from the wardrobe. I went back to being paralyzed by fear. As it continued eating, I realized that this would probably be it. My life would come to a close with no loud bang. I would die as unremarkably as I lived. At this moment I realized just how much I had taken for granted in life. All I wanted to do was break down and cry at the feet of God. Apologize for every transgression I have ever made against anyone or anything. Beg for my life. I began to quietly cry. A tear rolled down my cheek and I didn't want this to be the end. As the teardrops hit the floor, the feast stopped. My heart sank. I heard heavy panting from just beyond the desk, followed by a long and wet shriek. I could hear the concoction of blood and saliva being ejected from the creature's throat as it tried to communicate with whoever was outside. Nathan panicked. He tried to run and almost made it past the abomination. It shot its lanky arms out and grabbed Nathan by the ankle, dropping the big guy painfully to the floor, knocking the wind out of him almost immediately. He tried to scream, but the lack of air in his lungs wouldn't let him. I did something I still have trouble trying to justify. I ran. The way I saw it, Nathan was dead. He was a sacrifice. The moment the thing wrapped its bloody claws around his ankle, he was already reduced to a headstone that marked a closed casket funeral. I pivoted around the desk, knocking over every desk as I passed it to give myself as much lead room as possible. I heard Nathan's last attempt at a hoarse scream get cut off with a loud crunch. It let out one more high-pitched scream before I heard it begin to chase me. No, run after me. I pivoted around the doorway and ran down the hallway, one foot in front of the other. I dipped and dodged every stack of boxes and bookcase in the hallway, while behind me I heard it barrel into every single obstacle and keep going unfazed. At one point, after I had reached the west wing where we had entered, I turned around to see it galloping on all fours after me. It was closer than I had thought. Only about 5 feet behind my back foot. I kept running. My legs burned as if my veins pumped battery acid. I turned one last corner and saw the entrance to the room that contained the open window. I powered through and slid on the floor, catching myself by gripping the doorframe and sliding my feet in. As I took my first step inside, the thing was going too fast to stop on a dime. I didn't waste the opportunity. I barreled straight through the window without trying to open it. I covered my face and the glass sliced through almost every piece of exposed skin. I crash-landed against the crabgrass lawn and flipped to my back. The deer peered out at me from the blinding darkness. The wax jacket it was wearing flopped open to reveal exposed ribs and muscle. It did not attempt to reach me, simply slinking away to finish its meal. I began to laugh hysterically. I had no rhyme or reason. It was just the only response I could muster up to keep myself from either passing out or shutting down completely. I lay my head back in reverence only to see a small child standing over me. He wore a small mask made from the skull of what looked to be a dog. He raised his finger to where I approximated his mouth to be in a shush gesture. I felt something sturdy crack against the side of my head, and I slipped into a peaceful sea of pitch black. When I came to, my head was throbbing and my hair felt wet and heavy. It was dark out by now. I have no idea how long I had been unconscious. All I knew was that it looked like the sun had set hours beforehand. In front of me were 8 figures around a bonfire. All were dressed in robes and wearing animal skull masks that obscured their faces. I tried to move, but came to the realization that I could not move. 2 large ropes had been tied around my chest and legs and kept my back flat against a tall oak tree. One of the figures approached me. A woman. Her blonde hair protruded the sides of her mask and draped down her shoulders. She pushed her face only 2 inches from the tip of my nose and I let out the only response I could think of. What is this? Who are you, people? I'll pay you anything. Please let me go. The woman removed her mask. Her face had been disfigured at one point or another. Large scars left tracks all over her face, her lips had been sliced open on multiple occasions. Shoo, she said, revealing a set of deep red teeth. She shushed me as if she were a mother trying to calm down an unruly child. It's not about money. It's about you, she said as she pointed one finger at my chest. Still talking in a calm voice. A sweet voice that almost made me forget where I was. She extended her left hand behind her with her palm open, still pointing one finger at me and never once breaking eye contact. One of the other masked figures, a man this time, handed her a large and very old hunting knife. She traced it up and around my torso, eventually landing on my stomach. She balanced the knife tip just above my belt buckle. This is going to sting, but it will all be over very soon, she said, still talking in that nurturing voice, before pushing the knife into my stomach. I was met with the worst pain I have ever felt in my life. I screamed and she shushed me again. She began to drag and twist the knife. When I wouldn't stop screaming, she covered my mouth. After what felt like 5 lifetimes, she pulled out the knife. It's all over, go to sleep, were the last words I heard before I lost consciousness again. When I came to, the sun had risen. The bonfire was nothing but smoldering embers and burnt logs. Around it lay the bodies of all 7 figures, still wearing their robes. The woman lay at my feet. Still. All at once I was reminded of the surgery I had been given the night before. My knees gave out and I slid down the tree into a squat that did nothing but exacerbate the pain. I let out another scream. Over the next several minutes I began to break away from the rope by sliding up and down the rough tree bark. After I was free, the next several days came in flashes. I remember running to my truck only to find it destroyed and bleached like the others. The next thing I remember is running into the road, covered in blood, and screaming like a madman. At some point, a truck must have stopped for me and let me in, because the next thing I remember I was trying to mumble the story to the driver as he drove me to the nearest hospital. When he helped me limp through the sliding doors, I collapsed from blood loss. According to Dr. Foster, I died for 2 minutes as they tried to fill me with as much blood and essential fluids as I had lost. Over the coming days, I recovered in the hospital, keeping a close eye on who entered my room. Police came by as soon as I was lucid again, Wiltshire County Sheriff's Department, their badges red. They asked me as many questions as they could before disappearing again. After 5 days in the intensive care unit, I was finally transferred to a shared room and was finally able to sleep through an entire night. I don't like it here. Last night a nurse came and woke me up in the middle of the night. It's all over, just go to sleep, she said, smiling at me, revealing a set of deep red teeth, before everything went black. Comment by Shadow Wolfman 13 days ago. This was terrifying. You described it all in so much detail I could see it all. Not sure you're lucky because you lived, but the nurse seems non-human too. Sorry about your friends. Best leave abandoned things alone like you were told to.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.